Manos se juntaron en la calle y las aceras, la voz se hizo multitud.
Balcones y portales se hacen eco de banderas, un tiempo nuevo abraza el porvenir.
Multicolor la marcha de gigantes que se empeñan, semilla imprescindible en su raíz. Mamisa y soberana va, la isla que precisa, erguida frente al temporal, airosa va retando al mar. Soberana va, la isla que precisa andar, erguida frente al temporal, airosa va retando al mar. Mamisa y soberana va, la isla que precisa andar, erguida frente al temporal, airosa va retando al mar. La patria sujetando está, tanto que con vida más, el beso entrega libertad, razones para continuar.
Mano para arriba, mi gente bonita que
Por el futuro seguimos adelante, y aquí no hay marcha atrás.
Vamos todos adelante, ni un pasito para atrás, que la mentira es mentira y la verdad siempre es verdad.
Futuro seguimos adelante,
Vamos para adelante mi pueblo,
y aquí no hay marcha atrás.
trabajando con mi gente, viviendo la realidad. Vamos a seguir cantando para el pueblo, para la prosperidad. Oye.
Futuro seguimos adelante,
A mí, please,
y aquí no hay marcha atrás.
cerra por capacidad, chicos.
Aquí no hay marcha atrás. Aquí la libertad será. Y aquí no hay marcha atrás. Aquí la libertad será.
viste lo que te dije.
Aquí no hay marcha atrás.
Parlar y jugando.
Aquí la libertad será. Y aquí no hay marcha atrás. Aquí la libertad será.
Mano para arriba, Cuba. Mano para arriba.
Aquí no hay marcha atrás.
Cuba, 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 Cuba.
Aquí la libertad será.
¿Qué dice?
Que aquí no hay marcha atrás.
Welcome, welcome everybody. I hope that you all enjoyed that. Buenos dias a todos que están aquí con nosotros. I do want to let you know that there is interpretation today. Our speakers will be speaking in English, but there is interpretation available in Spanish. Los hablantes de hoy van a hablar en inglés, pero hay interpretación en el icono de globo por Zoom para cambiar la interpretación al español. So please participate there. I see the chat is very active. We've got lots of folks online introducing themselves, where they're coming from as we open today this webinar, Cuba Under Siege, an Action Conference, pre-conference webinar, Let's Stand with Cuba. That song was Aquí no hay marcha de atrás. Here, nobody is going marching backwards by Arnaldo Rodriguez y su talismán. My name is Tamara Hansen. I am the coordinator of Vancouver Communities in Solidarity with Cuba, an organizer with the U.S.-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition, and author of 5 Decades of the Cuban Revolution, The Challenges of an Unwavering Leadership. My co-host this afternoon is Cesar Omar Sanchez, who is one of the 5 co-chairs of the National Network on Cuba, and also a member of the Cuba C New York, New Jersey Coalition and the U.S.-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition. I'd like to acknowledge that this event is being broadcast from the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, which is in Vancouver, Canada. And as we defend Cuba's right for self-determination, we also must stand with Indigenous nations to defend their right to self-determination. And if you are living on unceded and occupied territory, I hope that you will also think about our responsibilities. We are honored to have you all join us today in this urgent time for Cuba. We are organizing this webinar to talk a bit about news and analysis of the situation in Cuba as the United States attempts to further strangle Cuba with its illegal and immoral blockade, and also discuss how we can strengthen our campaigns for Cuba in this time. All of this webinar is leading up to Saturday, March 14th, when we are organizing Cuba Under Siege, an action conference in New York City and also online, which will feature a delegation from the Cuban Federation of Women. There's a website, actionconference.org, where you can learn more about the March 14th conference. I'd now like to pass over the virtual microphone to my co-MC, the wonderful Cesar Omar Sanchez. Go ahead, Cesar.
Gracias, Tamara. Gracias. Saludos a todos. Bueno, thank you all for coming. I think it's, I'm very happy to be sharing this moment with you all and to speak about the urgency of this webinar and why we need to have this discussion. I think that's something that it's like, in many ways, you know, what Cuba's going through, it's not a surprise. It's more than 65 years of a blockade. So this pre-conference webinar is to continue to have the dialogue, to broaden our solidarity, to expand, to collaborate, you know, and I hope that even though we are now in a virtual digital world in this screen, and you see me in this screen right in front of me, you know, just engage, chat, you know, give a shout out where you're coming from, hit that emojis, hey, you know what, give that heart, thumbs up, you know, put your fist up there in the air, you know, with the emojis. I mean, any way to try to engage. We want this webinar to be an open dialogue, very engaging. You know, we're trying to make it very accessible to everyone and to understand the importance of this webinar. Now, our program today will include 3 initial honor speakers who will analyze and report on the current situation in Cuba, increasing the U.S. threats against Cuba. And after these 3 speakers, we will have a short Q&A, and we will move on to our other exciting speakers. We will discuss in how we get involved in activism, campaign for Cuba, collaborating more. We will bring messages from support from other organizations. You know, before I do that, I want to hear from you all. Encourage everyone here to chat, post, share. Hey, you know, get on the phone. Hey, listen, man, listen. This, you know, send a text. You know, this is a great webinar. Check it out. You know, even if it's like for 10 seconds or in 10 minutes or 20 minutes, just please, you know, just share it with everybody. This will be live streaming, as my dear sister says, Tamara. It's going to be on YouTube. And we would like to share the video with your Cuban friends. As probably as you know, part of the criminal of the U.S. blockade on Cuba is the blocking of the Zoom in Cuba. Of course, sometimes our special guests are able to find a way to work around to join us. We share our webinars on YouTube so that more Cubans can learn from the solidarity movement in the U.S., Canada, Quebec, and internationally. So, and I'm just gonna speak, and I'm just gonna start off with our first speaker, honored friend, comrade. We have talked many times, and he's actually the Cuban for the U.S. mission, Cuban mission ambassador. And I'm honored to introduce to you our first speaker, Yuri Gala Lopez. Por favor, Yuri, the virtual stage is yours.
Yuri, you're muted. Your tu micrófono.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. Just
perfecto, yeah.
Well, I was saying that I would like to begin by greeting everyone watching this event online. I'm Ambassador Yuri Gala, and it is indeed an honor for me to represent the permanent mission of the United Nations, the permanent mission of Cuba to the UN in this special webinar that you have put forward. And I really thank you for that. Again, I'd like to thank the organizers and the other speakers that are to be soon sharing some important information at this webinar. I think this is not only an important event, but also a very timely event in the current context. So in my case, I like to share a number of ideas. I have noticed that the webinar flyer says Cuba under siege. As it is well known, the US government policy of hostility towards Cuba has been in place since the very triumph of the Cuban Revolution back in January 1959. So there has been a long history of Cuba being under siege. And that policy of hostility has remained essentially unchanged for more than 6 decades, simply because our nation dared to achieve true sovereignty and independence and preserve it, which is important to highlight, with a socialist project that continues to stand despite so many predictions against it that have proven to be wrong and will continue to be so. On the other hand, I have noticed, and you too, I'm sure, that representatives of the current US administration, as well as certain groups, individuals, and media outlets, have been promoting the narrative that Cuba is on the brink of collapse. But they fail to understand, dear friends, our courageous people and our long history of struggle and resistance until the nation finally achieved true independence in 1959. While we're going through a very complex economic situation now, this is not the first time that this has happened in the history of the victorious Cuban Revolution. In our thinking as emancipated people, there are no wars such as collapse, defeat, or surrender. We will never betray the legacy given to us by our martyrs and heroes, and I want to emphasize that. Despite being under siege since the very beginning of the Cuban Revolution, Cuba has always had an internationalist vocation, offering and receiving solidarity and cooperation. For example, as you know, Cuban medical cooperation with other nations formally began as early in 1963, and since then, more than 600,000 health professionals have provided this type of cooperation in 165 countries around the world, mainly in the global south. It should be recalled also that in January 1966, Havana was the setting for an event that had a profound historical significance, the Tricontinental Conference, officially the first Solidarity Conference of the peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. That meeting of 1966 gathered delegations from dozens of countries and national liberation movements at a time when much of the world was still living under colonialism, apartheid, or various forms of external domination. At the Tricontinental Conference, ideas about solidarity with independence processes were discussed. Colonial wars were denounced, and the need to build a more just international order was raised. Today, 60 years later, the world is different, but some of the tensions that motivated that meeting remain. Deep inequalities between the North and the South persist, conflicts over sovereignty and resources continue, and many countries still denounce the application of unilateral economic sanctions and coercive measures that severely affect their populations. In this context, let us recall the recent military attack to the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, when the constitutional president Nicolás Maduro, Moros, and comrade Cilia Flores were kidnapped. The government of Cuba issued a statement in which we clearly condemn, in the strongest possible terms, the military aggression carried out by the U.S. government against Venezuela, while categorically reaffirming Cuba's absolute support and solidarity with that sister nation and its government. 32 brave Cuban combatants died as a result of that aggression, which constitutes a criminal act and a violation of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. So, honor and glory to those Cuban heroes who fell fighting fiercely in an unequal combat. This was an aggression with objectives of domination aimed at reviving U.S. hegemonic ambitions over our America, rooted in the Monroe Doctrine. So the 2014 proclamation of Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace is an aspiration that is now under attack by the U.S. government. On the other hand, one cannot help but look at the situation in Cuba. Precisely on February the 3rd of this year, it was marked 64 years of then President Kennedy's signing of the executive order that formally established the U.S. economic, commercial, and financial blockade against Cuba, thus implementing the recommendation contained in the well-known Mallory Memorandum of 1960. Since then, the strategy of economic encirclement and suffocation has become a central component of U.S. policy towards Cuba, with the aim of limiting the Cuban people's right to exercise their sovereignty and build an independent project free from hegemonic subordination. The blockade has a broad and integrated extraterritorial component. So we're not dealing here with a simple embargo or prohibition of trade and investment between Cuba and the U.S. What we're seeing is a clear economic war that includes obstacle prohibitions and coercive measures to prevent third countries from engaging with Cuba. The blockade imposed by the U.S. remains in force and has evolved into one of the most extended and complex forms of economic warfare ever waged against a sovereign state. The persisting goal is the same: to deprive the island of necessary income, deteriorate the living conditions of its population, generate shortages of food, medicine, and other essential goods, and cause structural difficulties in its economic development. For more than 6 decades, the island has lived under the said blockade, a policy that the Cuban government and the overwhelming majority of the United Nations member states have repeatedly described as a form of economic aggression or pressure that is contrary to international law. The U.S. administration persists in ignoring the almost unanimous call from the international community to end this illegal and inhumane policy against Cuba. This demand has been reiterated in the 33 resolutions adopted so far since 1992 in the General Assembly, with the overwhelming majority of its membership. In the latest report presented by Cuba to the UN, we stated that between March 2024 and February 2025, the material damage caused by the blockade to Cuba is estimated to have amounted to approximately 7.5 billion US dollars, which is a huge figure for a country such as Cuba, a small island in the Caribbean. This blockade has been actually intensified in recent days with an executive order signed by President Donald Trump on January the 29th, intended to punish any country that trades fuel with Cuba, whether directly or through a third party. The government of the US has reached this point after 67 years of failing to surrender and destroy a genuine and legitimate political and revolutionary process of full sovereignty, social justice, and the promotion of peace and solidarity with the rest of the world. The Cuban government issued a statement where it condemned in the strongest terms the new escalation by the US government against Cuba in its efforts to impose a total blockade on fuel supplies to our country. That executive order declares a supposed national emergency under which the US government will be able to impose trade tariff on imports of products from countries that supply oil to Cuba. Therefore, that order constitutes a flagrant violation of international law. It confirms that it is the government of that country, the one that is threatening security, stability, and peace in the region and in the world. To justify such extreme action, the text of the executive order contains an extensive list of lies and defamatory accusations against Cuba. And I want to reiterate the following. The US government is actually aware that no one or very few can believe such untruthful arguments. Cuba has categorically declared that it does not harbor, support, finance, or tolerate terrorist or extremist organizations. Our country upholds a zero-tolerance policy against the financing of terrorism and money laundering, and is committed to the prevention, detection, and confrontation of illicit financial activities, consistent with international standards. Cuba has unequivocally condemned terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. Cuba does not host foreign military bases or intelligence installations and firmly rejects being portrayed as a threat to the security of the United States. The only, by the way, military base there is the one that illegally occupied the United States in Guantanamo. Cuba has never engaged in hostile actions against that country, nor will it permit our territory to be used against any other nation in the world. As everybody knows, including the US government, Cuba poses no threat whatsoever to the US, its national interests, or the well-being of its citizens. Cuba does not threaten or attack any country, is not subject to sanctions by the international community, and it is a peaceful, supportive, and cooperative country willing to help and contribute to other states in the world. Cuba, on the contrary, has said that it's prepared to resume a broadened bilateral cooperation with the United States in addressing shared transnational threats, while unwaveringly defending its sovereignty and independence. The Cuban people and the American people derive mutual benefit from constructive engagement, lawful cooperation, and peaceful coexistence. The executive order has negative effects on the Cuban economy and population. With a lack of fuel or substantial reduction in the amount of fuel we import, we will have difficulties meeting the needs of production, agriculture, food transportation, electricity generation, and the functioning of services such as hospitals, transportation, community services, schools, among others. And yes, this will force us to go through a very difficult period that will require a high degree of creativity, stoicism, and austerity, for which we have been preparing for some time now. And We think that even though it's a very difficult situation, we have made it clear that surrender is not an option for Cuba. There is much to defend. There are many dignified Cubans who gave their lives for this country and for this independence that we enjoy. And that's something that we cannot forget. And so that our government and people are not suffocated, we have a strategy. And recently, the Cuban president publicly explained that there is a program that we have updated and there are new measures. Therefore, the so-called imminent collapse is only in the mindset, in the hegemonic philosophy of the US government, but it's not in the mindset of Cubans. In our vision, there is the concept of creative resistance. We have experienced difficult times before. We are going to experience now quite difficult times, but we're going to overcome them with creative resilience, with the effort and talent of all Cubans, of the majority of Cuban women and men. On numerous occasions, Cuba has expressed its willingness to establish a civilized and respectful relationship with the United States. It is widely documented Cuba's historical willingness to engage in serious, responsible dialogue with the US government without pressure, based on international law, sovereign equality, mutual respect, reciprocal benefit, non-interference in internal affairs, and absolute respect for the independence and sovereignty of states. Cubans do not hate the American people, and we reiterate that Cuba does not pose a threat to the national security of the US. Cuba is a peace-loving and fraternal cooperative country ready to help and support other states. Allow me to conclude by reiterating that Cuba is also the country of a brave, combatant, and resilient people. Cuba's commitment to peace in no way undermines its willingness to fight in defense of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. If we were to be attacked, we would fight with the same ferocity that has been passed down to us by several generations of brave Cuban combatants from the 19th century onwards up to the present time. There can be no surrender or capitulation, nor any kind of agreement based on coercion or intimidation. Despite the persistent and hostile policy implemented by the US government, Cuba maintains a firm stance in defense of the construction of socialism. We will face this new US hostile escalation with firmness, equanimity, and the certainty that reason is absolutely on our side. Our determination to struggle is firm and unwavering. The decision is one and only one: homeland or death. We shall overcome. Patria o muerte, venceremos. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Yuri Gala Lopez, representative at Cuba's permanent mission at the United Nations, for bringing that talk to us today. I'm very honored to invite up our next guest, Peter Kornblue, who is a senior analyst for the National Security Archive and director of the Cuba Documentation Project. He has written many articles on Cuba for a variety of periodicals, from Cigar Aficionado to Mother Jones, as well as The Nation and the New York Times. His books include Bay of Pigs Declassified, The Secret CIA Report on the Invasion of Cuba, and co-wrote with William Leo Grande, Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. So thank you so much for joining us today, Peter Kornblue. Looking forward to your words.
Thank you for having me. It's a very difficult time. It's a tremendous moment for an effort to push back and support the efforts of the Cuban people to end the suffering that they've endured at the hands of the United States. I want to particularly thank the U.S.-Cuba Normalization Coalition for its efforts to organize this and for its activist position. I think we all can safely say that we want normalization of relations. And there are many tragedies at many levels, a human tragedy that's unfolding here in front of our very eyes. But one of the tragedies for me is that just 10 years ago, we were well on our way to normal ties. In just a few weeks, it'll be the 10th anniversary of President Obama's historic trip to Havana. And even though one can make an argument about the sincerity of the US position on Cuba at the time, the truth is it was a historic trip. It was meant to advance the cause of normal relations with Cuba. I was there to witness that, and it really was an extraordinary occasion 10 years ago. There were so many positives, among them positives that the ambassador to the UN just alluded to, agreements to collaborate on counterterrorism operations, on counter-narcotics operations, on normal migration procedures, on environmental protections for the Caribbean that affect us all. There was a support for the private sector, which was just beginning to expand in Cuba. And in fact, Obama's agreement with Raul Castro opened the door to US travel to Cuba and support for the private sector that tourists like ourselves brought. And it was something to see. Thousands of people in the streets of Cuba, tourists, cruise ships, an expanding economy. It was extraordinary. And we have to remember it was Donald Trump who abrogated that agreement in 2017 when he became president for the first time. He had an almost systematic rejection of everything that President Obama had accomplished, not just the Cuba policy. And Cuba policy became part of his efforts to roll back everything that Obama had done. He replaced Obama's position of normalization with Cuba with a policy of what was called maximum pressure. And this was a whole series of sanctions that included beginning to sanction various shipping companies for transporting goods to Cuba, put Cuba back on the terrorism list, which restricted Cuba's ability to do banking normally around the world. And the maximum pressure policies did contribute to the humanitarian crisis that Cuba was suffering, frankly, for a few years now, well before the attack on Caracas that we saw on January 3rd of this year. But now we are in a situation of a quantum escalation of that policy of maximum pressure. And it's not just a ripple effect through the economy now of the oil being cut off to Cuba. It's a tsunami effect. Daily, whole sectors of the Cuban economy are starting to shut down. Foreign travel is significantly curtailed. Canadian airplane companies are not going to be able to fly to Cuba anymore because there's not jet fuel that they can then use to return. Russians are sending empty planes to retrieve their tourists who are already in Cuba because they aren't going to be flying in the future. Hotels are closing as the electricity goes off. Of course, as the oil stops, electricity goes off. There isn't electricity for the water pumps, so Cuban people cannot get water. There's just a series of impacts that will get steadily worse, particularly as the hot weather comes in the summer. But this is happening extremely quickly, and it is a dire situation. Now, in terms of the strategy of U.S. policy, this is an issue that's nuanced. Those nuances don't make any difference, I think, to the suffering of the Cuban people and the impact on Cuba. But there's still nuances that I think are worth us knowing about because they could, in a sense, give little openings for our efforts to push back against this policy. The the thought is that what the United States is trying to do is force the Cuban economy into a collapse with the following scenario: deprivation of the Cuban people, the creation of discontent, ensuing riots, repression by the Cuban government of those rioters, and that becoming a political justification in the United States for a more open U.S. intervention, military intervention in Cuba. I think that's the scenario that a lot of people see as the U.S. goal, but the nuances here are somewhat different. It appears that the Trump administration, Marco Rubio, President Trump himself, have learned the lessons of Iraq and the Pottery Barn rule that then Secretary of State Colin Powell famously told President George Bush at the time before the U.S. invasion of Iraq: "You break it, you own it." And there's certain signals from the Trump administration that they would prefer not to see a complete collapse of the economy in Cuba, but rather to use the ratcheting up of this pressure, cutting off the oil, and then kind of dangling the possibility of restoring oil shipments as a way of forcing the Cuban government to the negotiating table to essentially capitulate their sovereignty and fall under the control of what's now being called the Dunroe Doctrine, the U.S. preeminence, not only in the Caribbean, but of all of Latin America. This is a policy that's affecting many countries in Latin America, not just Cuba, but Cuba is clearly next on the list of efforts to advance this doctrine of U.S. hegemonic control over the region. And in some ways, Trump has made zero secret that it is his broader intent. He is a wannabe emperor, and emperors need empires. And the Western Hemisphere has traditionally been seen by presidents before him and now himself as a sphere, not just a sphere of influence, but a sphere of intimidation and a sphere of control. Historically, of course, there was the Cuban Revolution that stood up to that presumption of hegemony, and that is why it's been a target of Washington for all of these decades. Now, there are these little signals that the Trump administration wants to push Cuba to the negotiating table, and as Trump has repeatedly said, make a deal. This is one of his favorite expressions. Make a deal, but it's a deal that would be made certainly under pressure. But increasingly, you are getting little hints that a good part of that deal would be the opening of the Cuban economy. And in some ways, there is a possibility of common ground for dialogue, and for there to be a deal, dialogue has to take place. Now, Fidel Castro famously said that Cuba would never negotiate with a dagger at its throat. And certainly there is a dagger at Cuba's throat right now. At the same time, it seems that there is at least an initial effort to start some type of dialogue between the two countries. President Trump has repeatedly said that the United States and Cuba are talking at a very high level, obviously secret level, what we call back channel discussions. The Cubans have gone back and forth in terms of whether there is any talks or not, but have acknowledged that there have been messages and communications. There are interlocutors who have offered their good offices, principally the president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum. The U.S. attaché to Cuba, Michael Hammer, is actually now on his way to the Vatican. The Vatican played an extensive role in the secret talks between the Obama administration and Raul Castro's emissaries 12 years ago, when secret talks were going on to arrive at that breakthrough in relations. So there is, in my opinion, a possibility of finding some common ground. And certainly, as I think the history of back channel diplomacy between Cuba and the United States shows, and And we wrote about this in our book, William Leo Grant and myself, Back Channel to Cuba, the hidden history of negotiations between Washington and Havana, a history that goes all the way back to the Eisenhower administration, frankly. As we wrote in the book, dialogue is possible, and it's obviously preferable to an escalation of U.S. aggression. So in my personal opinion, I hope that the two sides are engaging in a secret dialogue that somehow moves this issue forward without Trump resorting to escalating U.S. pressure on Cuba. We all have a role, I think, in pushing back against him trying to do that, as do other countries around the world. And let me just say that other countries are starting to speak out and send at least token representations of humanitarian aid to Cuba. Chile is one of those countries. Its president, Gabriel Boric, has just recently said, the blockade that the U.S. has imposed on Cuba and has intensified in recent weeks is criminal and violates the human rights of an entire people. And indeed, the United States is engaged through this punitive economic strangulation of the Cuban economy right now. We are engaged in kind of mass human rights violations. And that's not, for those of us who are U.S. citizens on this call, that's not who we are or who we should be. And so it is our task to push back against that ongoing crime that we are witnessing and push for a return to those efforts at normalized relations that were being conducted and going forward so promisingly a decade ago, and would show us that that is possible, that normal relations between our two countries that do respect the sovereignty and independence of the Cuban state are not only possible, but obviously preferable. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter Kornblue. I mean, for your insightful policy, grounded, deeply informative remarks on Cuba. I mean, your analysis of the impact of the blockade, and I like how you mentioned the recent hope for the oil supplies and how impactful that's going to be on Cuba, both on a humanitarian scale. Your words help us ground our work, our political context, and we're very grateful, Peter Kornblue, for your clarity and your commitment. Thank you. Our next speaker right now is Dr. Rosemary Mealy. Dr. Rosemary Mealy is an activist, educator, and author of Fidel and Malcolm, Memories of a Meeting, who has taught at the City University of New York and Florida International University and lectured at the Universidad de La Habana. She is widely recognized for her lifelong community activism, advocacy for political prisoners, gender equality, and to end U.S. sanctions on the sovereign nations, including Cuba. Longtime friend of Cuba, she lived and worked there as an internationalist and journalist at Radio Havana, Cuba. She's a recipient of Cuba's Friendship Medal and the ECAP 65th Anniversary Medal. Serves on the board of IFCO Passes for Peace while advising community-based youth and social justice organization. Dr. Rosemary Mealy, the virtual stage is yours.
Good afternoon, Cesar, and thank you very much. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to participate in this Zoom call and Cuba Under Siege, March 14th, the Action Conference. But first, I want to send a special greeting of love and solidarity and resistance to the people of Cuba from the United States. We hear you during these challenging times. We know that Cuba recognized years ago and continued to do so whenever its sister nations were under siege, whether it was from environmental issues or not, Cuba was there. When Africa called, you answered. So today we're answering as you face tremendous economic challenges. While adopting these measures, as Ambassador Yuri mentioned, to confront the energy crisis, and these are all framed as a result of the illegal and criminal blockade of the United States, and I might add its attempts to bullying sovereign nations in efforts to break friendships based on mutual interests of international solidarity. A few weeks ago, after we returned from Cuba with our intergenerational delegation of 19 folk, having attended the 65th anniversary of the Cuban Institute for Friendship with the People, ECAP's anniversary, I was having a conversation with my 20-year-old granddaughter about our journey, where I described the impact of the harsh economic challenges that Cuba is encountering, and that's brought on by the suffocating attempts at suffocating Cuba with this blockade. And I talked to her about the energy crisis and how it impeded the daily lives of every Cuban, while at the same time, every neighborhood that we saw was navigating a collective solution. And this was just before Trump's January 29th executive order released under the title Fact Sheet, which has been referenced here, Threats to the United States by the Government of Cuba, which, just as others on this program, as I mentioned, have described in more context. But this fact sheet was really another declaration of an emergency and imposing punitive tariffs on countries that sell or otherwise provide oil to Cuba. And from my perspective and others, it's really nothing more than another act of collective punishment against every Cuban child, woman, and man. And it's dressed up as a national security policy. I also shared with my granddaughter how our incredible journey included a visit to the province of Matanzas and the Playa Giron, where most of us will know in English, it's the Bay of Pigs, and there's a museum. But before going to Playa Giron, we stopped at a community center called Corimacao. And this is a community cultural project, which is about 110 miles from Havana. And the project was founded in 1992 in the midst of what you have often heard of called Cuba's special period. And this is right after the Soviet Union left, now Russia. And right in the midst of that, it was a difficult situation. I was actually living there during that time. But this project is right in the heart of the Zapata swamp with its unique ecosystems, and it's surrounded by a social and historical environment that propels the life and meaning to the project and to the people who live in the area. And in that project, we witnessed amongst the young artists, they presented to us this international event. It was like a performance, and they gathered, it was like more than 100 of them. That's a part of this high spirit performance group. And they gathered and they gave a presentation which really rocked the audience. And despite the blockade, with its rationings and its lack of material sources, these young people had still fashioned a natural backdrop of simple creative art designs with incredible aesthetic sensibilities, right in the remotest population of pockets of Cuba. And this Corimacao has become like a pioneer center of Caribbean and Latin American communications art. And you know, my granddaughter responded, Abuela, what you described is a level of hope that exists among both Cuban youth and its people, which is rooted in their resistance, and a resistance that forged their revolution in the first place. And then we furthered this conversation where she reminded me that if the enemy believes that if people have lost hope in the possibilities that there can be a better world for people to thrive and to realize better lives for their children, then the enemy will win. But she went on to tell me, but when people know their history and reflect on their victories, it instills hopes for future generations, where people and entire nations act on their convictions, whether it's individually or collectively. Then that hope, she reminded me, becomes an eternal form of resistance. And this was what we were reminded as adults, and as our delegation was reminded again at our final stop at the Museum of Playa Giron, where I recently wrote in a series of syndicated articles published in several US Black press. and I quote, "Since the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in January of 1959, the United States government has sought through a wide range of covert and overt means to overthrow the Cuban government. And these efforts have included thousands of acts of sabotage and terrorism organized and financed in our name by the CIA and other anti-Cuban operatives. And the most infamous of these covert operations was this disastrous Bay of Pigs, as Professor Kornbluth mentioned. And so that invasion of 1961, the United States has never reconciled itself to that colossal military defeat when its anti-Cuban mercenaries sustained many casualties and they were captured or they fled in disarray through the swamps of Playa Girón. And for Cuba, still in the earliest stages of its revolution, Playa Girón represented a decisive victory against the U.S. empire. And it achieved that victory despite the United States' superior weaponry and all its artillery and its air support. So Playa Girón, as I mentioned to my granddaughter, is just one of the sustaining memories which have been passed on and imprinted already in the DNA of 3 generations of Cubans who have known nothing but a U.S. blockade, and they have resisted in building socialism. So it is that history of defeat against the U.S. government and its tyrannical obsession for the past 60 plus years, where Cubans today are teaching us here in the United States and around the world, as its government and its people are confronted and facing one of its greatest humanitarian crises. They are teaching us that the United States empire, as has been quoted, no longer cares about international opinion, because the United States, under this authoritarian Trump regime, it's abandoned the rhetoric of democracy and human rights, and it's shown their most predatory face. Cubans remind us that in a similar era, when Ronald Reagan threatened to wipe Cuba off the face of the earth, they are now teaching us that their history, and they reference Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro, who said, and he stated with crystal clarity, and I quote, "I am absolutely convinced that the only way to deal with this situation is to maintain a firm position and grow stronger." So today for Cuba, there is no other path than the one we have already taken, they are telling us, to confront, resist, and ultimately defeat the enemy on any terrain they impose on us. So today we're witnessing a period in history when the forces of Western capital are intertwined with these crises at home and globally. In the West, the crisis is the continual decline of the socioeconomic conditions for life for the majority of citizens, particularly women, people of African descent, and people of color, young people in the working class in general, alongside increasingly the financialized economic systems, which are predominantly only successful in generating increased income inequality and concentrated wealth accumulation. So that is why here in the center of capital, our solidarity movement must grow and expand into other struggles where we have to organize to teach how and why it is in our interest to defend Cuba. That is why we take delegations, because it is our task. It is our task in the context of this rise in reactionary use of force, from the genocide in Gaza to regime change strategies in Venezuela. This authoritarianism of the Trump administration impacts our communities in the form of state-sponsored violence, surveillance, and the support for racial and religious superiority ideologies. And those are some of the connections as internationalists where we will be successful in bridging and building and expanding our solidarity movement. We have to defend Cuba because it is in our interest to follow the path of resistance, as our Cuban families and friends are doing, because they are defending socialism. We are reminded of the late great African leader Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau, who attended the 1966 Havana Tricontinental Congress, where Ambassador Uri referenced earlier. And Cabral said, quote, "There are only 2 possible paths for an independent nation: to return to imperialist domination, neocolonialism, capitalism, state capitalism, or to take the way of socialism. End of quote. In closing, yes, my granddaughter, hope does breed resistance. So we are here to build for the March conference, but we're also here to respond most immediately to the energy crisis Cuba is facing. And I have three things that I would like to suggest. You can support now by going to send solar generators and panels to Cuban hospitals at www.letcubalive.info/donate. That's www.letcubalive.info/donate. Or you could sign on to the call to a consciousness. And that call to conscience says, stop Donald Trump's cruel assault against the Cuban people. And you can sign on to that conscious call by going again to letcubalive.info/. And on February 12th, Representative Jim McGovern of Massachusetts, who was a ranking member of the House Rules Committee and co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, introduced legislation to repeal the statutory basis for the U.S. embargo on Cuba. It's known as H.R. 7521. It's called the United States-Cuba Trade Act. This would repeal or amend several laws codified over decades and referencing the Helms-Burton Law that restricts trade, exchange, telecommunications, and travel to Cuba, albeit limited. And there's a similar bill, S-136, which has been introduced in the United States Senate by Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon and Jeff Merkley, a Democrat of Oregon. So I implore you to contact your congresspersons and ask them to become a co-signer. And you can still travel to Cuba as U.S. citizens. Organize humanitarian delegations to take much needed supplies. Your church group can travel legally. And you can travel to Cuba also under the legal travel of support for the Cuban people. And all of this information obviously will be informed to you at the conference that's coming up in March that we'll talk more about. But these are just some points that I wanted to share with you today. And when you go to Cuba, please go to Playa Giron and visit everywhere in Cuba as you can go to now with the limited supply for delegations traveling. But go where you can and talk to Cubans and see for themselves. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rosemary Mealy, for that excellent and informative insight. We've had a few questions. Folks have said, how can we find out more about your delegation? And so I have added to the chat on Zoom the link to the Google Meet. Rosemary is organizing a webinar on Friday, February 20th at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific, 65 years of love for Cuba, and we'll be reporting more on what they saw in Cuba with their recent delegation. I'll put that in the chat again because the chat is busy and moving quick. We are also put the other campaigns that Rosemary mentioned into the chat, including donating to Cuba right now to send the solar panels to Cuba. There are 3 petitions in the chat, one from the Let Cuba Live campaign, another Canada Defy Trump, Sell Oil, Food, and Medicine to Cuba, which can be signed by anyone. And the third is a petition to the government of Canada on the issue of supporting Cuba in this time of blockade and calling for an end to the U.S. blockade on Cuba, which goes to the Parliament of Canada and can only be signed by residents or citizens of Canada. But there's 3 petitions in the chat for folks to sign. These are all important actions you can take. Folks have also mentioned that Code Pink is planning a flotilla to Cuba. There will be information about that in the chat. And we are going to be going into speakers who are all going to be speaking about campaigns you can get involved in. We're excited that we've got the Canadian Network on Cuba, leaders from the Union Movement, Puerto Rican Committee, from Quebec, from so many different places, the National Network on Cuba, who are all coming up in our program, who are going to speak more to how you can get involved with Cuba solidarity work today. We have quite a few questions in the Q&A box, and Yuri has a very short amount of time that he's able to stay with us. So we've selected one question that I'm going to ask Yuri, and then we're going to move on to our other speakers. We apologize, but as usual, the talks have been so excellent, and we just we're a little bit over our planned time for this section. So the question that we are going to ask is, what is happening at the United Nations about this issue, and what actions are they taking immediately? So I'm going to hand it to Yuri Gala Lopez to answer that question.
Thank you, Tamra. I think I like to refer to what is going on at the United Nations at this moment. After the signing of this executive order by the United States government. And on that light, I have to say that there has been a number of statements that have been issued by specific groups that are present at the United Nations, and I will put some examples of that. Obviously, our permanent mission has been participating very actively in a number of meetings, and in those occasions, we have been denouncing the adoption of this executive order that will put a lot of obstacles for Cuba to get the supply of oil or fuel. But it's not only Cuba. There are a number of other countries and groupings here at the UN that have been actually expressing solidarity with Cuba. One of them is the Non-Aligned Movement, which is a group of more than 120 countries, mainly from the South, from the global South. But they have issued a clear statement in solidarity with Cuba. They have published that statement, which it can be downloaded from the website of the Non-Aligned Movement organization. But there is also another group, which is the group of 77 plus China, that has issued also a similar statement rejecting the adoption of that executive order and expressing solidarity with Cuba. The group of 77 and China is comprised of 134 countries. So combined, we're talking about dozens of countries from the United Nations membership that has taken a public position in solidarity with Cuba. So in the case of the G77, we're talking, as I said, about 134, which is obviously a huge amount of the UN membership at this point. But we have also seen statements issued by other groupings, such as the one called the Group of Friends in Defense of the United Nations Charter, that has also issued a statement in solidarity with Cuba. And there has been other groups as well. I just saw recently on internet that the African Union just issued a statement in solidarity with Cuba in a meeting that they are having, or they just had. So this is important because it is the solidarity from the African region. So a number of countries there have joined in expressing solidarity with Cuba as well. So as you can see, the United Nations has been very active in expressing solidarity from a number of organization groups. I know that the spokesperson of the Secretary General of the United Nations has referred to the situation in Cuba as well. And we hope that other members of the Secretariat from the UN can come up with expressions of solidarity with Cuba, because it's important to actually express a clear position towards actions which are in clear violation of international law, of the United Nations Charter, and the organization itself has to position it's, you know, in a format that it can actually observe the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. The organization has a role to play when something like this happens, which is affecting not only Cuba, but is also affecting other countries. What is happening to Cuba now can happen to other countries of the world. So this is something that has to be rejected in a timely basis so that we cannot allow this to continue and to harm other peoples of the world. And in Geneva, I mean, I just referred to what's happening in New York, but in Geneva, there was also a recent statement by a group of independent experts. They are called Special Procedures of the United Nations Human Rights Council. They issue a fresh same statement, basically rejecting the executive order because of its humanitarian impact and because it violates international law as well. So those are just a number of examples. And obviously, a number of delegations, when Cuba has spoken in certain meetings at the UN, there have been some other delegations who have come forward in supporting the Cuban position. And we hope that many more countries can take the decision to express very clearly on this act of violation of international law.
Thank you, Yuri. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer one question. Unfortunately, because of the time frame and we could not extend the Q&A a little bit more. We do apologize to everyone. And of course, Yuri, I know you have to be leaving soon. But again, thank you so much, Yuri, for actually coming here and speak on on the situation on Cuba, and our commitment to you, to Cuba, will always be eternal. So, gracias.
Thank you. And I really thank you again for organizing this. If you allow me, I would like to invite those who have been connected to this webinar to take a look at the recent press conference that was given by the president of Cuba, Miguel Díaz-Canel, very recently, in which he went into very specific details of the situation there in Cuba, but more importantly, on what is the strategy to overcome the current situation. And obviously, we will need a lot of solidarity, a lot of cooperation from countries of the world, individuals, so that we can overcome this situation as soon as possible. But the main priority at this point, as is part of the strategy, is to try to preserve the fundamental services that we have with our population. And I'm talking about, schools, hospitals, and obviously there will be a number of events or activities that will have to be postponed or canceled, unfortunately. Just recently, we were informed that the International Book Fair was canceled because of this. And there are other events such as the International Congress called University 2026, which is on higher education, had to be postponed because of the current situation. But the idea, dear friends and those who are listening, is for our government to try to give priority with our very limited resources to the fundamental vital services to our population. It will require a lot of planning. It will require a lot of resiliency, because as you can imagine, fuel is fundamental for the functioning of any country in the world, especially those countries who are not producer of fuel in high quantities, which is the case of Cuba. So we are relying on important imports of fuel, but we have a strategy which is important. This is not the first time that Cuba is going through a very complex situation. We have had it before, and we are still here, and we will continue to be here. So rest assured that we will be finding solutions as we go along. But obviously, it is important to have and to count on the solidarity and cooperation of organizations, individuals all over the world, not only in North America, but also in other regions of the world. And at this point, I also want to thank those expressions of solidarity that have been conveyed to our permanent mission by a number of organizations and groups in New York City, and they have issued statements or published articles denouncing this new escalation by the US government. And I think that this is important because it creates or share information and give more details on which is taking place now against Cuba. So thank you very much to you all.
Thank you, Yuri. And you can count on us. You know, the solidarity with Cuba will always be eternal. We will never give up, and we'll continue to defend. Venceremos.
Thank you.
Well, as we said, we do apologize, but we have to jump up to our next speakers right now. And I am going to introduce right now a good friend and comrade right now from Canada, up north. And we worked on numerous, collaborated numerous webinars, projects. But next speaker right now is our dear friend and comrade, Julio Fonseca from the CNC Canadian Network on Cuba. Julio.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us to this webinar to support the just cause of Cuba. A big thank you to all the participants for joining us as well at this time when Cuba, as we all know, needs our unconditional love and solidarity to face the brutal onslaught of the US against its people. The Canadian Network on Cuba welcomes the initiative of the Cuba Under Siege Action Conference in March, which will be a great opportunity to unite all the voices against the US government barbaric assault on the Cuban families and take immediate and affirmative action to stop the aggression. The executive order issued by the US President on January 29 is an act of war on a sovereign nation. The US government has imposed a total blockade of fuel to Cuba, unleashing a humanitarian crisis the likes of which we have never seen in this hemisphere, while it coerces and blackmails the world into complicit silence. This is an act against humanity and international law, an assault on the survival of the noble and heroic people of Cuba by submitting them to collective punishment for existing. We are overwhelmed by the response of the Solidarity Movement in Canada, which has firmly condemned the US attack on Cuba and has supported very generously our campaign to raise funds and donate food supplies. We are sending a container on March 7th with food supplies, generators, and other items urgently needed, in collaboration with the Association of Cubans in Toronto, Juan Gualberto Gomez. Our petition in Parliament is now over 8,000 signatures, showing the growing awareness of the Canadian public on the matter of US violations of international law and human decency. We have sent letters to the Prime Minister of Canada and his Foreign Affairs Minister, to the presidents of Angola and Mexico, and other heads of state around the world, urging them to consider helping Cuba in these critical times. We are organizing a day of action on February 21st with rallies in support of Cuba all over Canada. On Sunday, February 22nd, we will have rallies again in several cities in Canada to denounce injustice, the genocidal intent of the US blockade, and to demand its unconditional end. In Toronto, later that day, we will have the Let Cuba Live Tribunal end Trump's economic war to condemn the US aggression on the Cuban families. On behalf of the people of Cuba, we will charge the US government with violations of Cuban sovereignty and universal human rights. We will continue our struggle for justice, defending the right of the Cuban people to live with dignity and sovereignty. We are willing and able to collaborate with other movements of solidarity with Cuba in Canada and around the world to open a united front to defend not only Cuba, but the whole world against US hegemonism and denounce the extraordinary and unusual threat that it poses to world peace. Abajo el bloqueo yanqui, Viva Cuba Libre. Thank you.
Gracias, Julio. Thank you so much for your talk. Thank you for keeping it under your 5 minutes. You're an excellent example for all of our speakers here today. And thank you so much for bringing that action plan from the Canadian Network on Cuba. I think lots of groups are going to be on the streets. I know next weekend for Cuba, February 21st and 22nd. I know groups across Canada are going to be in the streets for Cuba, and I think folks in the US as well. So we'll all be out together in support of Cuba. Thank you again. I'd now like to welcome to the virtual microphone Kevin Cusera. He's the district president of the International Association of Machinists and is joining us from California. A big welcome to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Tamara. It's an honor to join you here today to speak with you briefly, all of you, in support of the Cuban people. We're in solidarity with the Cuban people. Unions and our challenges with the billionaire class are hitting us hard, but there is an amazing uprising here in the U.S. An amazing pushback. The working class is taking to the streets, rising up, saying no to Trump policies, saying no to ICE, saying no to imperial colonialism. And all of this is making a difference through organizing like these efforts here today, this conference to end and defeat this humanitarian crisis in Cuba. We must and will continue to defend the sovereignty of the Cuban people and Cuba's right to self-determination. We must continue to protest. We must continue to make our voices heard in the streets, through social media, and beyond. We live in a capitalist system that doesn't give a shit about workers. And if we don't take on the capitalists, there won't be a world at all for any of us. The attack on Cuba and its rights, an attack on workers' rights around the world. This is an attack on workers' rights around the world. Our union and the AFL-CIO stands united with the Cuban people in solidarity. Thank you for inviting me here today. In solidarity.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And it means so much to us to have the support of labor. I've posted in the chat that 2 Canadian unions have issued statements in solidarity with Cuba this week, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers and the Canadian Union of Public Employees. And we're so glad to have you representing the International Association of Machinists here with us today. So thank you very much for that powerful statement. I'm now going to welcome up to the virtual microphone Deborah Santana, who is joining us from the Cuba Solidarity Committee in Puerto Rico. Deborah has also been a brigadista with the Juan Ruiz Rivera Brigade and retired professor of geography and ethnic studies at Mills College. A big welcome to you, Deborah.
Saludos. ¿Me ven? Oh, okay. I was not sure because I don't see myself. I just want to say saludos, greetings from Puerto Rico. And from the Comité Solidario con Cuba in Puerto Rico. I briefly just want to mention a few things to give some of you ideas of what we are most concerned about and what we have been working about. First of all, although the Comité has its own individual efforts here in Puerto Rico, we have been putting a lot of emphasis on coordinating with the Red Continental, the continental network in solidarity with Cuba, which is all of America Latina and the Caribbean. We just recently had our assembly, and we are coordinating our activities. We're also coordinating our fundraising drives because as a continent, we can make a bigger bigger efforts than the smaller ones that we do individually as countries. And for example, people are talking about solar panels and actually solar systems, since they also require the batteries and the inverters. We are involved in a continent-wide effort to put together a system for a hospital that we are collaborating with in Cuba. That's something that's more than individual efforts. Individual efforts are also welcome, but we are trying to make our solidarity as effective as possible, especially as we don't come from countries that are particularly in solidarity. And in my case, we're a colony of the United States. The United States invaded Puerto Rico at the same time that it invaded Cuba, and we're still a colony. And so that is one of the things that we are focusing on. The second thing is that we are not, we understand that the struggle to support Cuba's effort to remain free and sovereign and socialist is part of a much broader struggle. So we are involved, obviously, we are involved in solidarity with Palestine against the Zionist genocide that's happening in Gaza. We have been very involved and continuing to be involved in supporting the people and the government of Venezuela in front of this outrageous attack and kidnapping of their president and Primera Combatiente. We're very involved in that. And I must say, this is also connected to the United States, a very rapid military buildup in Puerto Rico, which we have seen, I mean, not heard it, which was used directly for the invasion of Venezuela and continues to be a factor here in Puerto Rico. So our committee is involved in all of these efforts, in protests, in educational campaigns, because we understand that this is all the same struggle. The last thing I want to talk about is that we are trying to make an effort as a committee to try to combat fake news. It is a tremendous problem, not only in the social media, but also the more corporate media, where we will very easily see half-truths, partial truths, and outright lies. And unfortunately, even our own people will sometimes share this, believing that it is actually truthful. We are trying to tell people to, before you share something, check the sources and let's discuss it. We have, as many of your organizations do, we have direct contacts in Cuba, and we can verify if some of the things maybe, well, this is something that, it's can't be discussed, or this is something that's completely untrue. For example, the secret negotiations behind the backs of the Cuban people. It's categoric denial. We know that Cuba is always open to dialogue. We know that. We know that many conversations must be held in secret. But it's one thing to do that, and it's another thing to say, well, we don't know because we're hearing Bloomberg said this and CNN said that. They are all arms of the US government. And I think we need to understand that propaganda, the ideological and media war, this is a weaponized war of mass destruction against Cuba, against Venezuela, against Palestine, against Iran, among other places. And we need to be very careful with that. Another, unfortunately, that I have to mention is that sometimes we will see articles that just coming out, articles or posts from people who we believe are in solidarity with Cuba, who have spent time with Cuba, who are now promoting a narrative of the Cuban people are stuck between the US imperialists and a repressive regime, dictatorial regime, which is oppressing the people. Sort of either or, that somehow we are against the blockade, but we're also against the dictatorship or the regime. It's a very insidious narrative. And we have been coming up with it, unfortunately shared, sometimes without thinking. So it's a concern that I have that I want to share with all of you. This is something we are trying as a committee to combat. That's all for now. I'm very glad to see this conversation. Viva Cuba, libre y socialista, abajo el bloqueo, y que viva Puerto Rico libre.
Gracias, Deborah. Viva Puerto Rico. You know, and I think it's very important to let our people watching this and listening this that, you know, Cuba and Puerto Rico share a pretty much intertwined history, and they have been really dos alas. Let's not forget about that. And Cuba and Puerto Rico have always going to have that relationship. So saying that, I'm going to introduce you to another Caribbean brother of mine, American, Cuban American, Danny Valdez. You know, he's actually organizer with the Democratic Socialists of America, Cuba Solidarity with Group, a Cuban American. He leads efforts to mobilize in support of the ending of the U.S. blockade and fostering a humane and cooperative relationship between both nations. He actually spoke to last year's conference at the Malcolm X and Betty Shabbat Center. So, Danny, stage is yours, brother.
Hello, it's good to see everybody again. Wow, what a difference a year makes in terms of the situation that we find ourselves in. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Danny Valdez. I am Cuban American. I grew up in Miami, you know, with everything that you can imagine that entails. But I now live in New York City, and on the organizing committee for DSA's Cuba Solidarity Working Group. And, you know, DSA has had, you know, some successes recently, especially here in New York City. And we are really thinking through how we can use DSA's strengths to show up for Cuba. And, you know, I really want to talk a little bit about how we can use this moment for mass engagement. Because I think one of the sins that we commit unwittingly is we kind of know how to talk to each other very well, but we have had difficulty, I think, breaking Cuba out, you know, into the popular consciousness. Right now, you know, in such a perilous moment, I think we also have an opportunity for a narrative breakthrough here. And, you know, I go back to, and I think about what happened with the way the American popular perception of Israel just completely fell apart over the last few years. And a lot of that was led by young Jews who, you know, were saying not in our name. And I think one of the things I really want to focus on is organizing Cuban Americans to do the same thing. I think that is like a critical piece of what's missing from the formula here. And I think most Americans believe that the United States is carrying out the will of Cuban Americans. And that is just not true. And we need to organize in the same way and be inspired by people like Jewish Voice for Peace and other organizations that were willing to speak out on a very sort of taboo subject in you know, Jewish culture and change the narrative, and we need to do the same for Cuban Americans. So if you are Cuban American and or know Cuban Americans and are interested in this project, I've put together a pretty crappy little website, but it's something for us to start off. It's CubanAmericansForCuba.org. And that's sort of a place where I'm gathering Cuban Americans who are interested. And again, the intention here is to build a low barrier of entry organization. You don't have to love the Cuban Revolution. You don't have to be a communist or a socialist. All you have to do is be Cuban American and understand that as an American, it's your duty to affect what your government does to your homeland. And that's the primary motivation for doing that. On the DSA side of things, we really want to build a campaign to push for a bill that was released by Jim McGovern last week that basically statutorily kind of repeals the blockade. And what we want to do is kind of build popular support for passing this bill, and to use that as a springboard to organize more people into the Cuba Solidarity Movement. And I have another link to share for you. We have we're putting together sort of a big launch call for this campaign that will feature Noah Colwyn and Brandon James from the Blowback podcast, which has a whole season on Cuba, which I highly recommend if you haven't listened to. It would be great if you guys could spread the word about that too. Again, let's use this as a mass galvanizing moment on Cuba. We're again, like, we got to break out. That to me is the primary goal right now. Change the American sort of perception and narrative around what Cuba is and what we're doing with Cuba. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danny. And yes, I'm encouraging folks to join on February 22nd. Stop the Siege on Cuba campaign launch is in the chat. The Cuban Americans for Cuba.org, the first link didn't work that you posted, Danny, but I've corrected that in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
It's there for folks. Thank you so much. We're going to go now to our next speaker from La Table de Concertation de Solidarité Québec-Cuba, the secretary of that organization, Sean O'Donoghue, a longtime friend of Cuba, a longtime friend of mine, and merci d'être venu, Sean, et bienvenue. Good to see you.
Oops. Thank you, Tamara. And I'd like to thank very much for the presence, all the great speakers, especially Yuri Gala Lopez. It's great to have you here, and all the Cubans that are listening in. And thank you to the American people who are really at the forefront of the struggle for peace and justice in the world, and especially to help Cuba, and our Canadian and other all solidarity people in the world. I'll just say a couple of words in French for the Québécois that are listening, and I'll be right back. Bonjour tout le monde, je représente la table ici et je vais parler un petit peu de qu'est-ce qui se passe au Québec et au Canada, les avances avec les pétitions, les syndicats. Je vais vous dire, beaucoup de monde appelle pour savoir qu'est-ce que nous allons faire prochainement. Mais vous allez recevoir des annonces. Il va y avoir un webinaire avec Susanna que vous connaissez. On va annoncer des manifestations, comme vous avez compris, le 22 et le 21 janvier. Nous allons participer. Et on vous remercie beaucoup pour votre appui. Beaucoup de gens appellent pour aussi faire des dons. Alors, vous pouvez nous écrire si vous avez des dons en aide médicale. Alors, je vais retourner en anglais. Merci beaucoup. So, thank you again, Tamara, for introducing me. And La Table is a member of the U.S.-Cuba normalization since almost its start. And we're very proud, and we are learning what America is. And I would have to say, sorry, United States is. Because there's always been sort of a prejudice that it's a bad country, but definitely not the bad people. And I transmit this to the people I know. We reject the blockade and all the measures that it has, especially against the sovereignty of Cuba, and also the countries that want to support Cuba. Since the hardening by Trump of the blockade effects, notice there's a lot of solidarity coming up, new things. We're getting calls from people to see what they can do. We're getting politicians involved that before were a bit more quiet. We've had some things, but right now, as Tamara said, there's 2 opposition members. Well, one has put in a petition in the Canadian Parliament, and it has several thousand names. I think Tamara said 8,000. Also, another opposition party member has come out in favor of supporting Cuban sovereignty. And both these men have talked with the Canadian Prime Minister. And maybe because of this, there has been some results. Canada now has officially announced that it will send aid to Cuba. And these politicians that I just mentioned, opposition politicians, are pushing also to have this include petrol, and so these are new things. We've had sent out letters that have and press releases that have given much more results than in the past. We had a TV crew for the Canadian-owned Radio Canada come with a camera and film the place where we gather aid and prepare it to send to Cuba. We send it usually through either containers on airplanes as cargo, or with tourists who can bring suitcases as a second suitcase, and they can bring that to Cuba. And it's all arranged with the ECAP in Cuba to make sure that everything is regulatory and they have no trouble with the customs. So we will shortly do like the rest of Canada and America in participating in having a webinar in French with the Cuban consul here, Consul Susana Malmiaca. She will give pretty well the same information that the ambassador did, I imagine, on last Friday in French for our population. And on the end of the month, at the February 21 and 22, we will have some sort of demonstration, either picketing or even a demonstration that will move down the streets. And one of our big issues right now is, well, our support is political primarily, and also through solidarity aid, basically mostly medical supplies at this point, and educational supplies too. So once again, I want to thank everybody. Merci tout le monde. Muchas gracias a todos. Viva Cuba, vive la soberanía de los pueblos.
Viva Cuba. Viva Cuba. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Sean. And for those of you, actually, please check the chat. There's a lot of information in there. You know, I think, again, as I said to the beginning, we want people to engage, connect. You know, we got to keep on amplifying this message in this webinar. We want people to participate. Now, I'm going to go to my other speaker. This is a dear comrade of mine. I see her now. For those listening and watching this, it's we have this thing that every time we say ourselves, we say uhuru, and uhuru, which in Swahili means freedom. So it's a great honor to introduce my dear comrade, which we actually, we met a few times, especially in Cuba.
Yes.
Yes, that's right. And Secretary General of the African People's Socialist Party, Uhuru, my dear sister.
Uhuru.
The stage is yours, my sister.
Thank you so much, Cesar, brother Cesar, and just really want to unite with this conference, this pre-conference, the panelists who you have heard, on today, and just really want to salute the U.S., Cuba Normalization Coalition, which is a part of this, influential and necessary Cuba Solidarity Movement, which is a strategic front of the anti-imperialist, the anti-capitalist, global anti-colonial movement. And so I just want to say, deep revolutionary love and salute, to the Cuban people on behalf of the African People's Socialist Party and the National Central Committee. We just want to send our, deep solidarity. And as was said earlier, when Africa called, Cuba answered. And I just want to, again, just remind everybody, and just unite with the calls to action that have been put out in this webinar, calling congresspersons petitions, the call to action, and forward to March 14th, Under Siege, Call to Cuba Conference. We will be there. And this webinar, is a statement, to the imperialists and to this, to this colonial state that Cuba and the Cuba Revolution lives on. And, if we fight, we will win. So not on our watch. And, on behalf of the African People's Socialist Party, it's a great honor to speak here on today and to say that the African People's Socialist Party was founded with the goal in May of 1972, with the goal to complete the revolution of the 1960s. This was a time when revolution, as we understand, was the main trend in the world. And, we fight for the democratic rights for African people wherever we have been dispersed, Africans in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Quebec, everywhere that we have heard, and we join the struggles of other oppressed peoples of the world in their struggles for national liberation in the face of imperialism and, which we understand has its roots in colonialism. And so we salute the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban people and their struggle for power. And as we say in the African People's Socialist Party, that the highest form of democracy for the oppressed is self-determination. And so Cuba represents the future. And this is a really important, as we have heard from all the reports today, that despite the genocidal, blockade on Cuba, the Cuban people remain committed to their socialist economy that they have fought for. And we are confident in this period that, we will, see it through if we, because we have to understand that this is something that also the imperial powers recognize as well. They recognize that Cuba represents the future, and Cuba is a powerful, plays a significant role in negating, this colonial mode of production, this, social economic, system that the whole world is locked into, that we are all deeply connected to and tied to. And we are seeing its manifestations in what is happening in, Cuba. And so we have, I want to just also say, with the time that I have, that we have joined, delegations, and we invite people to go and to, be a part of organization, to use this opportunity to, stand with the Cuban people, because as, when we stand with, the Cubans, we are not doing a favor. We are, forwarding our own liberation struggle as well. And, I just want to say that, one thing that I appreciate, that we see when we are giving aid and, providing, different support to the Cuban people around the world, is that Cuba will institutionalize this support that they receive. This is not simply some kind of charity work. This is, work that is about, producing and reproducing life, for the Cuban people. And so this represents, a part of the struggle against colonial domination of, the mass, people of the world. So being behind the struggle against, to defend Cuba, is a strategic front that we must all take up. And to speak of that front, Compa Cesar, mentions, the times that we have been, seeing each other. One of the ways that we organize is through the Latin America front that is, building in terms of, under the banner of Hands Off Uhuru, which also came under attack in 2022, but which was, reminiscent of the attacks on the Black liberation struggle. And so, the chairman of the African People's Socialist Party, I want to appreciate the chairman, and, who reminds us that at times like this, the oppressor pushes us to consolidate our ability to resist. And so we must formalize these organizations and these forces against, colonial capitalism, and build this anti-colonial, human rights, front, these various fronts, these organizations that it's, not just Cuba, but Venezuela, but Palestine, the U.S. front, Africa. So I think that that's something that I'm taking away from this, is that we, recognize that, we must recognize that to end the blockade, when we say take Cuba off the list, open the trade, all of this is that, but if we did all of that and colonialism, the system that oppresses the masses of people of the world still existed, it is not the world that even Cuba would have fought for. And so we have to, pull together revolutionaries in this process, and not just a multipolar world with colonialism here and, revolutionaries over here, but a world where the workers, which is what we see in Cuba, what we love about Cuba, the workers who, who are bearing the brunt of production and reproduction of life, they are liberated in this process as well. And so this pre-conference is a part of that strategic objective for us to build collectively. And we want to say, build the Cuba front, build the anti-colonial, front of the Cuban Revolution. And we say, end the blockade, take Cuba off the list, and we say, down with colonialism. So Uhuru means freedom. And I want to thank Cesar for, saying, introducing us with that. We believe that African people must have freedom on our mind 24/7, because we are still not free, but we say until it's won. So Uhuru.
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 Uhuru, thank you so much, Mwezi. Wonderful to have you with us, and such strong words, lots of support for you in the chat. And thank you, everybody who's with us. We recognize that our program today is a little bit longer than we usually try for on a webinar, but it was very hard to make sure that we covered all the issues that we wanted to cover and bring you all the great speakers that we wanted to bring in order to cover those issues. I'm now honored to welcome our last speaker to the microphone, and it's going to be Cesar Omar Sanchez, my co-host today. Cesar, as he mentioned, is also the co-chair of the National Network on Cuba, or NNOC, and Cesar is an organizer with New York, New Jersey Cuba C Coalition, and also with the U.S.-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition. But for this talk today, he is representing the National Network on Cuba. So welcome once again to the virtual microphone, brother and compañero Cesar.
Thank you, Tamara. I know we're actually very close now, but before everybody starts logging off and start just like, leaving the room, please stick around. I just a few announcements that I want to make. It's a combination of an announcement. If our dear comrades, Allison, in the back could actually show the screen if possible, share the website of the Action Conference, which I want to highlight. I'm encouraging people to not only endorse it, but to participate. The link has been actually in the chat a few times, but I just want to really highlight the importance of this conference. This is not just any other conference, but we're taking action. This is the state of war. That's the mindset. We want people to really come to the table, to bring ideas, to collaborate, to really work together. We're working with comrades from LA to Chicago, from Chicago to New York, Philadelphia, Michigan, and our network continues to expand. And that's the objective, to expand, to continue to build the solidarity with Cuba, because Cuba, as Yuri said, is under siege, and it has been under siege since the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. So we encourage people, please go to the site, endorse it, but also try to come, try to participate. It's amplify this. Please send the link, share this link to everyone you know. I also want to highlight too that if you go to the nnoc.org, there's actually a lot of information. One of them that I want to particularly highlight is the medical aid caravan, the car caravan, which the ACC, which is the Action for Cuba Committee, a phenomenal group. I want to give a shout out to all the members out there who was like, I see like 300, sometimes 400 chats in that group, but everybody is taking action. I mean, we have raised, and if people could just actually, if I could share that page too, if possible, because I want people to not just participate, but to also donate. I mean, yes, unfortunately, in the belly of the beast, everything is capital, and to build these, to have these caravans, to have these kinds of organizations, we need your help. We need we're fundraising to, helping to bring Cuba, medical aids to Cuba. Again, we're working with all organizations. This was actually, actually initiated by our dear comrades from Michigan. And I think I want to give a shout out to all the ACC, especially to my dear comrade, Aaron. I hope you're there listening to this. And I mean, me and him, we've been going back and forth on this, but I mean, thank you. Continue to support this. Again, if you go to nnoc.org, and it's actually a section right there where you can support it. A few more things, and I'm almost done, and we can wrap this up. We got a week of action. If people could actually share the registration, there's a link, and if people could drop the link in the chat, I will highly appreciate that. There's a week of action that NNOC is calling. We're actually asking people. It's from March 5th. I believe it's the March 8th all the way to the 15th of the actual conference. We want people to actually start putting in all the information, everything you're organizing, so we could try to share with everybody else. Again, this is the week of action. This is going to lead all the way to the conference. I believe it's March 8th all the way to the 14th of the conference. So if somebody, yes, thank you so much for actually putting the link in the chat. Please, if you have something, you're organizing it, fill out the form, and we will reach out to you, and we will try to collaborate in terms of how we continue to, amplify your event along with ours, and to continue this solidarity work. And of course, the last thing I want to mention, there has been a lot of talk about a flotilla. And again, there's so much going on and stuff. I don't know. I know it's a great idea. I'm thinking hundreds, thousands of boats. There's a lot of flotilla from Gaza. Now there's actually flotilla that's going around talking about to bring to Cuba. Again, I believe it's letcubalive.info to donate. I mean, there's a lot of information there as well too. Again, if you could just drop that link onto the chat as well, or share the screen, that would be really great. So again, I mean, there's so much to cover, but I feel that we already have a short amount of time. But thank you all. Thank you to all my panelists that was here that spoke. Thank to all my comrades, all to all my brothers and sisters from New York to Chicago, LA, all of you. Thank you. That's and last but not least, I'm sorry, and just one more. There's an emergency protest picket, and it's going to be held on the 22nd. It's in New York City. So if you guys can participate, please come. This is very urgent. Cuba needs us. We got to keep consistency. We got to keep fighting. We got to keep struggling. That's all part of the movement. So again, thank you all for giving me the time to speak. And Tamara, I guess I'll pass it back to you one last time, and we can talk about the announcements. Gracias a todos. Ciao.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias, Cesar and the National Network on Cuba, for all those actions for folks to get involved in. We have been posting so much in the chat today for folks to get involved in. People have asked if we will email out the links, and yes, we will organize to get you on our MailChimp for the U.S.-Cuba Normalization Conference Coalition, so that you will receive email updates about the conference, but also so that you can get the links and information from the chat today. I am not going to be able to go through all the announcements quickly, but again, if you have money and you are able to donate to Cuba, there are two very worthy campaigns. One is to send solar panels to Cuban hospitals with letcubalive.info. The other is the Global Health Partners and Saving Lives Sutures for Cuba campaign to send sutures or stitches to Cuban hospitals. These are in shortage in Cuba right now, and this are required for life-saving operations. So those are two ways that you can donate to Cuba. There are at least 3 petitions online right now for Cuba. They've all been posted in the chat. You are encouraged to go and sign those petitions. Of course, all of today is leading up to the conference in New York City on Saturday, March 14th. The conference will also be available online, and we hope that you will join us. The website is actionconference.org, and we will again be emailing folks more information about that. Again, a reminder, on Friday, February 20th, there'll be a report back from Rosemary's delegation to Cuba, and on February 22nd, there'll be another online event for Cuba that was mentioned by Danny earlier. There's an upcoming Nuestra America flotilla setting sail for Cuba, and so many other things that folks have posted about in the chat. So we appreciate all of your support for Cuba, wherever you can donate time, money, social media posts. Everything matters at this point. We are in a critical moment, which we have heard about today, and we need to do more for Cuba. As we wrap up today, we are going to go to another song. We opened with some Cuban music. We're going to close with some Cuban music, just because we've been sitting in our seats for nearly 2 hours, and we deserve a little bit of music to get us going. This song was by Christopher Simpson and Elevación, and was promoted during Cuba's participation in the Summer Olympics in Paris. It is called Tiempo de Vencer, which means it is time to win. And of course, yes, it is about athletics and winning gold and silver and bronze at the Summer Olympics, but it's also a message that I think is for all of us today, that we will win. Vamos a vencer, venceremos, and now is the tiempo de vencer, the time to win. So as we thank you all for being here with us today, let's go and wrap it up with this beautiful song.
Yeah, let's get those mojitos going.
golpe de sudor escalaba, con cada paso un sueño gigante. La lluvia trae tierra mojada, pero pronto secará. Hoy el cielo da sus colores a los que con fuego le alumbran. Con el reto siempre vienen temores, pero sé que pasará. Es el día de avanzar, a la cima he de llegar. Todo el mundo a mis pies, anunciando el tiempo de vencer. El momento llegará y la historia crecerá. Una luz se puede ver, anunciando el tiempo de vencer. Te pueden susurrar del naufragio, que es palabra no permitida. Es lección de vida, no es un presagio. Aprender a retomar. En medio del ciclón la escalada, y en cada paso el sueño gigante. La lluvia trae tierra mojada, pero sigue hasta el final. Oh, es el día de avanzar, a la cima he de llegar. Todo el mundo a mis pies, anunciando el tiempo de vencer. El momento llegará y la historia crecerá. Una luz se puede ver, anunciando el tiempo de vencer. Anunciando el tiempo de
All right, everybody. Es el tiempo de vencer. It is the time to win. We thank you all for being here today. I also want to thank our technical support team, Janine Solanke and Allison Bodine, as well as our translation team of Jill and, my goodness, I apologize, and Mercedes. Thank you so much for your amazing work keeping this going in Spanish. Muchas gracias a los intérpretes, Mercedes y Jill. Thank you so much to our technical hosts. Thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to my wonderful co-host, Cesar. Vamos a vencer. Abajo el bloqueo. Lift the blockade on Cuba. Let us continue our work together. Unidos para Cuba, por un futuro y un mundo mejor.
Abajo el bloqueo.
Bajo bloqueo.
Uhuru. Abajo bloqueo.
Uhuru.
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 Good
Bye,
evening,
everybody.
everybody. Have a great afternoon. Let's continue our work together. Ciao. Abajo el bloqueo. Lift the blockade.
Lift the
Ciao.
blockade.
Now.